I am really, really pleased to be here. This is quite an honor for me. This group in Portland, the work that you all together have done and are doing, stands out in the United States amongst urban ecology interests and projects. So I'm very, in fact, honored to be here. So thank you for inviting me to this. I note that this is the 21st symposium, so you can now have a drink. And by the way, symposium apparently means it's Greek root for drink together. So we'll drink knowledge and experience together today. I come from the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. This is a building that was originally built in 1977 as one of the first active solar buildings in the United States. It didn't work so well. It's been renovated and has this new wonderful copper cladding, recycled copper cladding. There are cameras all over it, so hopefully people don't steal it. It's in upstate New York. It's about 70, 80 miles north of New York City in the rural fringe of Dutchess County. It employs right now, there are 14 scientists who study a variety of things, not only urban ecology, but ecology of forest change and invasive species, carbon dynamics, and climate change, disease ecology. I can't even go through the whole list. This list will probably grow in the near future. Now, what I want to tell you about, this is kind of interesting. I'm used to seeing my slides, and now I'm going to have to sort of turn away to remind myself what's on them. I'm going to talk about three things in hopefully relatively brief order. I've started a timer up here so I won't get quacked, I hope. What is ecology now? I want to talk about the Chicago school and its discontents. Why am I talking about the Baltimore school? Well, it's a counterweight to that. And I want to just summarize some of the contemporary approaches that we summarize as the Baltimore school. And we don't just own this in Baltimore. This is something that really emerges from urban ecology as a whole. What is ecology now? So it's a field that has changed scope and changed paradigm over the last 30 or so years. And I appreciate Alyssa pointing out the origins of that group at Rutgers, people like Joan Ehrenfeld, the late Joan Ehrenfeld, for example, and Tuvo Airola in the forestry department, people who looked at urban wetlands or forests in urban areas. And a lot of people didn't get it. When we first started the urban LTER in Baltimore, there was great suspicion in the LTER network. The LTER network had been established to kind of study the natural biomes of America and its territories. And so you'd go to the Arctic tundra or the Alpine tundra or warm deserts, cool deserts, short grass steppe, tall grass prairie, all, 3 minutes of it that was left. So you would go to these, quote, natural places. You would do ecology as far away from people as you could get. And so when the LTR network took the radical step to invite up to two, that meant that 0 was a possibility, urban LTERs in 1996, it was quite a shock, really, for a lot of people. And the first meeting that we had, that the leaders of the Central Arizona Phoenix group and we had with the rest of the LTR network was, it was kind of like, well, let's see what you do with this rope. I mean, it was just like, it was not welcoming. But let's start farther back. What is ecology now? Now, this is a definition that we've developed at Cary Institute that goes beyond the sort of stuff that you see in the old textbooks, the distribution and abundance of animals, or the science of ecosystems, as Eugene Odom might have said. And I'm going to read this. I'm not going to read much. The study of the processes influencing the distribution and abundance of organisms, the interactions between organisms and their environments, and the transformations of flux of information, energy, and matter. Now, the wonderful thing about this is that it focuses on things that are going on, interactions, things that are going on, not just entities, not just things or places. And if you take out the first three words, you get not just the study of, but the process, the actual models and understanding of those things. So this is where we can position urban ecology. It fits in there. Ecology is used in a number of different ways. It's used to delimit or to describe the field as a whole. It deals with specific models, like the ecology of the Columbia River or the Willamette River. It's done as a metaphor for a network of processes. And in this kind of way, you see it on commercials, you know, the Amazon ecosystem or the Apple ecosystem or something like that. Well, okay, I guess that's all right. Or you can use it as a label for a lived social ecological world, which is the way a lot of people use it. A lot of people who are not trained in ecology use it. And all of these, I can't, you know, I don't own ecology anymore. Before Earth Day, I used to own ecology, right? We used to own ecology. You would tell people, I'm an ecologist, and they'd look at you and you just knew that you had to tell them what that meant. And then after Earth Day, they knew what it was. So we don't own it anymore. And a lot of people use it to describe worlds that people inhabit and express. So all of these are legitimate ways. One of the tricky things that this means for us is that we've got to tell what we mean, right? We can't just spurt out ecology and expect it to land where we want it to land. Now, the Chicago School, Triumph and Failure of Analogy is the subtitle, was developed in the 1920s by the initial school of social science in the United States. Some folks who were trained in Germany, where you could get training in social science, you couldn't get training in social science in the United States, although we could talk about W.E.B. Du Bois over some of that drink that we're going to have. And the Chicago School was associated with Robert Park and Ernest Burgess. They worked on, as I've already indicated that they were trained somewhere else. They put this school together, this conceptual structure together, and this empirical approach together in the 20s. Ecology at that time was not only the second biggest city in the United States, it was the fastest growing city in the United States. It was changing in amazing ways. The population doubled in a decade. The source of new residents for Chicago shifted to the American South with the Great Migration of African Americans after the destruction of Reconstruction, and immigrants from Eastern Europe. Now, these patrician folks didn't know what to do with that. They personally were troubled by that. And so a lot of how they thought about what was going on in Chicago was, let me see if I can get this to turn into a pointer. Well, there is light there. Okay, that's a little light, but the third one down under tenets, urban pathologies. Sociology thought that village life, rural and village life, was the best thing you could do. So they automatically were anti-urban. And then you put all this confusion that these gentlemen had because of how Chicago was changing. And they come up with a bunch of tenets that are a little bit, when you look back on it, actually, if you read their book, it was Park and Burgess in what, 25 or 26? I'm embarrassed to say, I don't remember exactly. 25, let's say. That's close enough. You find that they describe the city as a series of rings with the business, the core business district, and then around that, rings that were inhabited sequentially, just like plant succession that Clements said it would be, a regular, deterministic, progressive process by which people who were better off were replaced by people who were less well off, and this moved out. All right. Very spatial, very whole community, not based on, so say, individual agency, things like that. So they also by adopting the Clementsian view of succession, that succession goes from herbs to grass to broadleaf herbs to grass to shrubs to small trees to big trees, and it stops with that quote climax. They took that idea and applied it to cities, that cities would go through a succession too. But oddly enough, the end phase was blight, which is a pretty judgmental word. This gentleman over here in the corner is neither Park nor Burgess. This is Paul Pearson, who was, when I met him, he was my partner in teaching general ecology at Rutgers. I taught general ecology, I think, every semester for about 1 million years, and I loved it. But I rotated through every animal ecologist who existed at Rutgers. It was me and somebody else doing the animals. And when Paul Pearson was the first person who really introduced me to the Chicago School. So we had a lecture in which he talked about urban ecology, and he had this list of pathologies. So, I mean, he completely adopted this Chicago School stuff. Now, this was in the late 70s and early 80s. The Chicago School has had a lasting chilling effect on urban ecology. And that's one reason why we bothered to phrase something as the Baltimore School. Let's remind people that this thing has been replaced and doesn't do what we need to be doing now. So he talked about rats and social, all sorts of social deviance and dysfunction. This isn't dead. This is a little clip I took from a blog. You know, if you look up, say, Chicago School of Urban Ecology on the web, you will find things. So people are not necessarily saying that it's the past and it's been replaced. Urban ecology pioneered by the Chicago School. Urban ecology pioneered by the Chicago School. It's a problem. So he talks about the characteristics of that school: deterministic, competition of whole communities, replacement of succession. It was critiqued amongst the social scientists for a number of reasons. One, it didn't really include individual behavior and agency. It was spatially too idealized. It was deterministic. It was essentialistic. It said this group has these characteristics and here are the environments that they're associated with. Environmental determinism. And they were using the wrong ecology. And now I trust Jennifer Light, a historian, on that. She has a nice description of that. The University of Chicago, I'm trying to hurry up. The University of Chicago was one of the places where American ecology was invented. Ali and Coles, for example. And they read, Park and Burgess and McKinsey and the rest had their students read the ecologists' textbooks. Apparently, they didn't talk to them. So what didn't they know as a result of that? They didn't realize that Clemens's 1906 600-page book on succession was being questioned by people like Henry Allen Gleason. They didn't realize that the analogy that they were bringing in from ecology was not, not graven in stone. It was not accepted. It was not the truth. It might have been accepted by the majority of the field, but it was undergoing critical evaluation. And then what some of us have contributed to over the starting especially in the 80s was the articulation of a new paradigm for ecology. I mean, just articulating it. I'm not saying we invented that, but acknowledging that essentialism was not the best way to deal with ecological entities, that deterministic change was not universal, that disturbance had a role to play, that successions weren't always A, B, C, D, stop. So there's a new paradigm that actually invites you to see how people are involved in ecological processes and how they influence ecological processes and vice versa. Urban Ecology Now, the Baltimore School, it's not a place. All right, it's not a place. This, by the way, is Public School 103, which Thurgood Marshall attended when he was a kid. So how do you build this conceptual school that we actually share with so many folks, many of whom are in this room? We started out by acknowledging that most of the work on ecology that had been done up to the 1970s, wherever it was, Europe or Asia or in the United States, was taking the ecological toolkit into the cities, taking that stuff that had been honed with 80 years of experience in forests and wetlands outside of cities, sometimes in agricultural fields, which were oddly studied as ecological things absent of humans. But you would take that toolkit into cities and you can say, where can I use this? Where can I use this? They didn't use it in downtown Manhattan. They used it in the old growth forest in the Bronx, which is which is my sort of next step after the Rutgers radicalism, with Mark McDonald, who was studying that forest. It was the only primeval forest in New York City, which doesn't mean that it didn't have problems. It did, but all forests have problems now. If you think about, I mean, from ash borer, which we're going to hear about, or climate change, or earthworms from other parts of the world that alter your soil horizons or something like that. So that's not such an unusual thing to see forests as having crises that they're dealing with. But what we could do once we began to look at this forest in the Bronx, the question was, how is this different from other forests? So we did a transect out on the same bedrock up into northwestern Connecticut. You couldn't run it up the Hudson Valley, that's different geology. And so that was doing ecology in the city. You go to these parks, suburban parks, state parks, and the old growth forests in the Bronx, and you say, how does it differ? Nitrogen deposition and processing differs, earthworm populations, fungi, heavy metals, all sorts of wonderful things we discovered. But that was a little dissatisfied, that left us with a little bit of a hunger still to know how this fit in with these places, these positions along the transect. And so that got us to thinking about the ecology of the city, not just going into the places where your tools fit, but saying, how do these other places fit ecology, not the tools necessarily? What do you learn about cities, neighborhoods, districts, if you use ecological thinking, not necessarily the specific sampling approaches that you would use in a forest or field? So ecology of the city is what we put into practice in Baltimore, to look at the whole metropolitan area as an ecological system. Now, here again, we run into this problem with the ecosystem idea that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the whole metropolitan area as an ecosystem, a social ecological ecosystem, or as Zev Neve said, a human ecosystem. Still an ecosystem, the whole thing. But you could then go into neighborhoods, you could go into green spaces, you could identify them and work with them as ecosystems, or you could take the whole neighborhood as a social and ecological system. And eventually, when we get more comfortable, when we get more embedded in communities, you realize that you're really necessarily working with people, and you are doing things, as Alyssa suggested, that relate to their interests and their concerns, not just our theoretical ecological concerns. And I see so much of that in what you're going to talk about here today. And so that we termed ecology, originally we called it ecology for the city, embedding in the needs of all residents and institutions in the city that had anything to do with environment or were affected by environment. Is there anybody who doesn't fit that description? But that we were really concerned, we were aware of and embodying their concerns and interests in the research to the extent that we could. And eventually we called that ecology with the city, because some people said, well, you know, 4 sounds like you're being paternalistic and coming in with black helicopters and you're taking information and maybe you give something to the authorities, but the people in the communities don't necessarily get anything. Well, that's not what we meant by ecology for the city. So, but we'll go ahead and call it ecology with anyway. The approaches are thinking about ecosystems and human ecosystems, using watersheds, and then the methodologies of transects, ordination, and gradients. The top row is what Tansley said an ecosystem was: the biotic complex and the physical complex interacting with each other in a circumscribed area or volume. He didn't say volume, but that's what he meant. If you really include humans, you could put them in the biota, but you would have to think about them not just as demographic agents or consumptive agents or productive agents in the sense of biomass or something like that. You would have to consider them as socially structured biota, social animals who rely on institutions and economies and cultures. Well, let's not just hide it in there. Let's pull it out and call it social features, all right? And then the physical environment might as well consider or contain the built, the infrastructure, the wires, the pipes. But let's just talk about it all as constructed, because you're also working with levees and filling areas and topping off hills and filling valleys and things like that. So it's construction in all senses. That's what a human ecosystem is. Watersheds, something that's very familiar to you all. It's remarkable to me how many cities in which watersheds don't appear on the radar of the authorities or the residents. About 40% of people in Baltimore, if you tell them what a watershed is, and then you ask them, do you live in a watershed? 40% of them will say yes. If you do the same thing in Phoenix, I don't remember the number, but I think it's less than 10%. So that's odd, isn't it? That watersheds wouldn't be important in a desert city. I guess they think it's just pipes and drainage or supply canals. But there are watersheds there too, right? This is a little watershed on the edge of Beijing in China. It's about 90 some square miles. And this shows a nice way to combine the physical stuff. What is going on? How does that watershed integrate the different environments in it, just like they would do at Hubbard Brook or Coweta or Andrews Experimental Forest, just to think about the place here in Oregon. You put a weir down at the intersections, you document your land covers, you document what people are doing. Now, I'm going to give you too much to read here, but you look at the physical environment, the biological environment within that watershed and the things that might be changing in that. You look at how that watershed, the various parts of that watershed are connected with each other, not only through the water, but through other sorts of overland and social processes, how it is connected to downtown Beijing, how it is connected to vacation home rentals in Europe and America. You can go on the internet right now and look up Yanqi Valley guest house or farm stay. And you'll find, now you're going to do it. And you'll find that you can rent a house, you can rent a room. That's connectivity. This is a watershed that looks rural. It's acting urban. Livelihood, this sort of connectivity changes the livelihoods. People say, well, why am I going to bust my chops in a farm when I can rent out the house to a bunch of rich English folks? And so that leads to different sorts of lifestyles as well, moving from a production lifestyle to consumption and leisure lifestyles, entrepreneurial lifestyles. So watershed can have all sorts of deep social implications as well as ecological implications. This is we call the continuum of urbanity, by the way, to say that your urban places are not isolated, and a lot of things that you think of as rural or wild places have intense urban influence. Transexordination gradients. I think I'm not going to talk about this except to complain that when people talk about urban-rural gradients and say there is no urban-rural gradient, that's because they're taking a transect and calling it a gradient, and that's not the same thing. Okay, that's somewhere else. So one of the big things that urban ecology has to deal with is contemporary urban realities, and one of them is urban is exploding around the world. Diversity in forms and trajectories of urban change are immense. The boundaries of urban systems are diffuse and porous. Urban structures are intensely complex, and there are feedbacks and nonlinearities involved in it. And then I've already talked a little bit about the connectivity within and beyond urban areas. 1950, the redder you are, the more urban the population of that country is. 1950, ancient history, right? Green is not very much. Red is mostly is greater than 75%. 1950, 2000. 2050. The world is becoming urban, which Henri Lefebvre said in 68 in French and 70 in an English translation. We can't ignore that. Here's the diversity. This is there's Europe, there's Asia, there's Africa, there's North America in this. What is the city? Here's the lower, this one, the lower, what is that, lower right? That's in Tanzania. Looks like the country. It's highly urban. If you look closely, which you can't because it's too small, all of these houses are one story with rebar sticking up, waiting for the people who are working in Europe and America and other places, the bigger cities in Africa, to send money to finish the house. This is not the country, all right? It's not the city, but it's urban. And it's changing in different ways. The lower right is some change in China. They're switching from a majority agricultural population to a consumptive urban population. That's a government strategy. Will happen, is happening. Diffuse, complex. You can take 5 cover types and generate with some simple rules 951 abstract cover types for the city of Baltimore. This should work anywhere. Connectivity in various ways. Where cities used to be isolated, now they're parts of large urbanized landscapes, regions, mega regions. And here's thinking connectivity globally. So I'm going to skip this because the quack is coming soon. But so what I've hoped to do, and I have 34 seconds, so I will take the liberty of finishing this sentence. Urban ecology now is a really different thing than back in the days when urban was seen as something you just didn't do. It's a lot more openness, a lot more dynamism, a lot more recognition that everywhere people have a role. The Chicago School, which you still find as a definition of ecology, of urban ecology, worked from ecological analogies. It worked from the wrong ecology. And it suffered social critiques. It did some good things. The case history method in social science was invented in that school, for example. Contemporary approaches for urban ecology, I've talked a little about ecology in, which still needs to be done. Ecology of, which manifestly includes humans and human artifacts and activities. And the fact that we have to deal with how ecology is useful to people, and not just people in power, but all people. People in fact, we need to spend particular attention thinking how we can be useful to people who are specifically disempowered. All right, so there we go.
What you think about the implications. Can you hear me now? Good.
Yeah.
The implications of people working from home a lot more now in terms of urbanization. Thanks.
People working from home is changing the flows of traffic. It's changing where people recreate. It's changing the base of businesses that have formerly served folks in, quote, downtown offices, all those little lunch spots, and even some high-end restaurants that served that sort of business base are shriveling. In our own area in the Hudson Valley, COVID has, if you think about 10 counties north of New York City, COVID has increased the house prices in our area. It has increased the rental prices in our area. It has really reduced the vacancy rates. It's caused an affordable housing crisis. It has impacted our conservation areas, people from New York City coming up to be able to do maskless recreation in our parks. No, I'm just kidding. Which is, that's great. But so yeah, there are big changes. And so that's going to mean, if you think about this continuum of urbanity, it's going to change our land use. It's going to change our city economies. It's going to change our suburban structures. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you.